In this video I want to create conditional formatting on my graph where the color will change depending on the months. I want future months to have one background color, and then I want the most recent months to have a different color. This is fairly trivial to do in Tableau, as I've shown here, where you can straight up add a background color as a measure to your graph. In this case you would say that certain months would give one value and some other months would give another value, and then you'd add that to the graph. This is the page I want to create today, where I have two parameters showing the most recent months that I want to color with this blue color, and then the future months which are shown on the side. I can then manipulate these two parameters to change, well, how many months do I want to look into the future, and I can decide what months do I use in order to create this calculation. All I've prepared so far is that I've added a basic calendar table, and then I've added my data, which I got from a webpage called Social Blade. This is a subscriber count for a certain YouTuber. I then want to calculate, well, what growth can I expect in the future based on the most recent months. And we can see a massive growth between July and August, which will be a problem when I do my calculation because this does not reflect the average, which is why it's so important when you do a linear regression to have multiple data points and not just the most recent points, because that will severely skew your results. I want to start out by adding my parameters, which in my case will be numeric ranges. I want my last X months to be between 1 and 12, because I always need at least 1 month of data in order to calculate a regression. We just say that the default should be 3. And I can see that I actually messed up here, because I set the increment to be 12, but I want that to be 1. I want my maximum to be 12. So that explained why this was a bit confused. And then I should have named that properly. That's what happens when you record. Likewise, I want my future X months parameter to also be a numeric range, which will also set to 12 with a default of 3. The trick to creating my solution is that it's actually 3 independent graphs which are then overlaid. My first graph is simply a line graph which has my date as the x-axis and subscriber count as the y-axis. So I can add a new measure which will simply sum the subscriber count column. I then want to make some changes to the visual of the graph. First I want to set my minimum, and this is because I need two graphs to overlay properly, and I want to make sure they start and end at the same point. That's why I also want to fix my maximum. The maximum date is going to be the max date that I have data in, and then I'm going to add one in order to be able to highlight this point. For my y-axis, I want to have a maximum based on a measure. The reason for this measure will be revealed once I get to the second graph. I want the y-axis to go up to the max subscribers plus some value, so that there's always some white space at the top. I want to take the maximum of my subscribers month, and then I want to round that, and then I want to add some number to have some white space at the top, and then I want to do a rounding, and then I can add that as my max value. And that was a bit too high. The last thing I want to do is to remove the title, because that's not necessary right here. I also want to remove the grid lines, because they aren't helpful, because they don't convey any information. And lastly, I want to add a fixed line, which will be my maximum. And that is fine. The second graph is then an area chart, which I will lay underneath this line chart. Since I've already added formatting to this graph, I want to change that, so I'll copy it. And then I want to change that to an area chart and make some deletions, because we don't need the x-axis since we already have that from the second graph. I also don't want the max line. I only want the coloring underneath the graph, not the actual line itself. I want to remove the line, but I don't want that kind of color. But I don't want the color underneath the line. I want this entire block to be colored, as I showed in the preview. I want to change what my y-axis is. Instead of the actual subscriber count, I want a large number, which will then create the desired effect. But I need to use my parameter in order to create this effect to only show the months that I'm interested in. And before I forget, I want to change this parameter to actually have the proper name. In order to only show my desired months, I can do a simple if statement to see if my date is within the desired range of dates. I want to create a new measure called latest x subs, where I first want to grab the latest date with data in, which is then a max, and I want to remove any existing filters from my table. So any filter applied to the TBL Uruka table. And then I want to grab the earliest date, which is then in the past. So take the max date, our latest date, minus in this case 3 months, and grab that date. And I can do that using the edate function, which conveniently moves in terms of months. All of my data is from the first of the month, which means I don't have to account for some months having 30 or 31 days. I can simply add or remove a certain number of months. I want my latest date, and then I want to go into the past, so negative, and then I want to grab the parameter value. I now have my data range, so I can say if, and then I want to grab my current day. If my current day is then greater than or equal to the early date, so if it's 3 months in the past or after that date, and simultaneously less than or equal to my latest date, then I want to return a large number. So I'm going to grab my max, and then I'm going to add a very large number. And otherwise I want to return blank, because then the date is outside of my range. So we can then replace my value. If I did everything right, then this works. So we can see this peak here. I made the mistake of not fixating my y-axis. If I set this to 0, I have the desired effect, because my maximum is then far less than the value I actually show here, which we can see, which bleeds through in my tooltip. And I want to turn off the tooltip so the user can highlight this area. But we now have the desired effect, except this graph is in the front because I made it after. I can go under the View tab and click Selection and change the order of my two graphs in order to put that in the back. But this then has a white background, which I need to remove first in order to make this transparent. I can remove the background under the Effects tab, say that right now it has a color of white with a transparency of 0, and I want maximum transparency. And then I need to order this properly, so move that a bit to the right. So this is a bit finicky, but it should have the desired effect. And actually I can see that's because I removed the x-axis values, which I actually want to keep in order for the two graphs to be aligned properly. I want to go back under the x-axis and say I do want the values. And then if I overlap them, I can make it so the x-axis labels are colored in white in order to sort of make them invisible. So now the graphs are aligned. And then if I change the last X months, this coloring moves. So that was the second part. Now I need to show the future, which I will solve using linear regression. And I want that to be able to change based on the amount of months you choose. So this needs to be variable instead of being able to calculate it whenever you hit update. My calculation is going to use a lot of variables, and they aren't necessary, but I think they made it easier to understand. So I'm going to keep them in. First want to grab the current subscribers, ignoring any filter applied on my data table. Then I want to grab the latest date again. And again, I want to ignore any filter applied on my data table. Then I want to grab my future date, which will be based on this parameter. Again, I want to use the edate function because that adds a certain number of months, which my dataset is very convenient to start at the first of the month. I want my latest date, then I want to add +1 and whatever value I grab from this column. And I want to add the +1 because I want to show extra dots, and we'll see that once I make the graph. Lastly, I need to grab my past date, which I also get using the edate function. It also relies on the latest date measure. Here I want to go into the past based on my last X months parameter. In this case, I need to grab the most recent data point and then 2 points backwards in order to calculate my regression. In order to do my regression, I'll create a new table using the Linestx function, where I want to use a filtered version of my data table, where I first want to remove any existing filters on the table. And then I want to add a new filter, being that I only want future dates or the most recent date. Because the point of the last X months parameter is I only want these 3 data points in order to do my regression. My Y values is then the subscriber count for the given months that I'm including. And lastly, my X values are then my date column. And I figured out how to use the Linestx function from the SQL BI blog, because I did not discover that on my own. This function outputs a table, and I only need to grab one column from it, being the slope 1 column. This link also explains how to grab that column, because I want my slope to be equal to the selected column from my regress table, and that column is then named slope 1. And the problem is then that this is a calculated column inside of a calculated table. So this is sort of a hack solution. Then I need another variable to calculate, well, how many days do I need to create my graph over? So I start on the most recent date with data. I start my graph on the most recent date with data, and then some amount of time into the future, which is based on my parameter. So I want to store how many days between the latest date and X. And I get this using the date difference function, I want the difference between the latest date and the minimum value of my calendar table, so date column. I want to grab that difference in days. And I want to use minimum because in my scenario, all of my data comes from the first of the month. But in a real life scenario, you might have multiple data points throughout a month. Then I want to calculate my subscriber count based on the date and the slope, where I want to convert this into a number. And I just needed to do this in order to get the calculation to work. I want the current subscribers, which is then the subscriber count of the most recent date. And I want to add the slope multiplied by the day difference, which I grabbed from the last variable. Finally, I only want to do this calculation for the days that are within the future X month period. So final calculation should then be if the maximum of my calendar table is found within the range of dates between, and I get my dates from the calendar date column, and it should be between the values of the latest date and the future date. And if this is true, I want to do the future subs calculation. I want a C here. Then I want to return my final calculation. This graph shows the most recent data point and then 3 more points. And that's why I had to add 1 here in order to calculate the future date. I still need to do formatting on my graph, but other than that, the calculation is actually done. So the more months you add, the more accurate this is, or at least it has more data points to do the regression. But this y-axis needs to be fixed. So I want to remove the title, and I also want to add this constant line in order to show that the two graphs are connected, but this should then be a minimum. And I also want to show my values, but I don't want that k. Actually, no, I do want that, but I don't want any decimals. And I also want to remove the grid lines because they don't offer any information. I don't want to make any changes to my x-axis because this will change depending on how many months you select. So it's actually fine that this can change. But I do want to fix the y-axis. I also want to remove the title for the x-axis. For the y-axis, I want to set the minimum to 0, as I did in the second graph, in order to keep this fixed. And the maximum should also follow this measure. That way the y-axis are fixed. And actually I should make that a bit bigger now, because the future values will be greater. Let's say plus 40,000 instead. And then I actually wanted this to be an area graph in order to have the color that I showed at the start, but I don't want that to be blue. I want that to be gray. The final challenge was to make sure that these two graphs line up, but I can see that I forgot to set the y-axis to 0. So now they should be more properly aligned. The last thing I need to do is to make the background transparent for the right graph in order to overlap the graphs, which again is found under General and Effects. I want the transparency to be 100%. Now it's just a matter of getting them aligned. And if I make my graph a bit smaller, then if I'm lucky, yeah, it won't show August, because actually getting all of this aligned properly is difficult, to say the least. So if you really wanted to, you could make a white box and then have that be behind the second graph and have that white box be behind this graph. Actually, let's do that. So I want that to be white and behind the right graph, and then make that smaller. So this is a very hacky solution in order to get this background color to work. So ideally Power BI would add this as a native feature because it's quite cool, I think, in order to show that, hey, I am basing my regression on these months and then these months are in the future, so they should have a different color. But that's all I wanted to show. So